Hi, and welcome to this session with Jono Alderson. Jono, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. How exciting.
I love talking to you. You're always teaching me stuff, and you're the geeky guy who gets the bigger picture.
Oh, I wonder where that was going for a second, but I'll take that.
Yeah, all right, brilliant. You've taught me so much over the years. I'm super happy to be talking to you about the bots and the algorithms. So just to remind everybody, if you've forgotten, as we've gone through these sessions, we have the bots that record, the algorithms that activate, and that's what we're talking about. And also how you feed the bots through the traditional bots that crawl, IndexNow, MCP, and WebMCP, and then hopefully annotation and the algorithmic trinity. But first of all, the whole thing about DSCRI is discover, select, crawl, render, index.
There we go.
Rather than just crawl and index. Give me your overview of that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think, so the render bit's the interesting bit, right? Because that's the new-ish bit. And we only really started talking about that a few years ago. I say a few years now, like SEO years are like dog years, I don't know. But for a long time, the mental model was like discover, crawl, index. And this render bit adds a whole bunch of complexity because it turns out that the modern web, which I'm sure we'll explore in a moment, is more than just static words on static pages. Like a lot of it is complicated, interactive, often JavaScript powered stuff that loads at least partially and often completely on the user's device after the server response. So if you just had crawl and index, all you get is like the shell and the framework, the piece of software's wrapper, and you never get all the stuff that software would have loaded, which is why most websites, when you load them, have all these loading spinners and blah, 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 blah. That rendering phase is the bit that then produces most of the content. So we now have a paradigm where if you want to understand what's on this page because you want to ingest it, you want to evaluate it, you want to rank it, you want to recommend it, it's not enough just to retrieve it and index it. You also have to render it and parse it and extract and compare both versions because you don't know, like if you've got the pre-rendered and the post-rendered version, they're both different. Which is the right version, which is true. So it adds this whole extra layer of complexity where you've got to experience the thing in the way that a user would in order to extract all the content, the context, etc. And then you can start to play with it. So yeah, and that in turn makes the whole first half of the funnel tricky. Like the whole retrieval process becomes more complicated because in the process of evaluating that rendered surface, you might find a bunch of links. Or you might find a whole bunch of interactive stuff that reveals more content on different, so the whole thing has this extra layer and dimensionality and complexity. Yeah, super interesting.
And it kind of explodes out of control. And so, I mean, that makes me also think about the fact that LLM bots generally, or always, I don't know which it is, don't render.
Absolutely, and this is why suddenly this has become very interesting. Yeah, because almost all LLMs, AI tools, etc., are just fetching the server response. They're going, give me the HTML, and yeah, so they're missing a whole bunch of the picture. I don't see a world where that changes anytime soon. I think the amount of technical complexity and cost involved in rendering versus just retrieving is enormous, and that's why it's taken Google a decade to normalize doing that. And then also the overhead on that reconciliation piece of like, how do I compare the server response to the rendered response and what's the difference? Which one should I trust? Like 10x is the complexity and cost on top of that. So you've got all this extra overhead, which is why most LLMs we see still relying very heavily on either Google or Bing's index, because those indexes have already done the work of rendering. So there's this kind of weird dependency crutch here where, LLMs, I think, for certainly the long term, A, won't render, and B, will be reliant on retrieval and RAG from search engines that do. So there's a weird synergistic relationship there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so basically the big two, Google and Bing, their indexes are going to be dominant for years to come.
Yep.
And then what happens when they've used the index to decide what to show and what to use, and then potentially just go and crawl the content in order to follow up? They don't get the same content. There's a problem there.
Yeah, or they're crawling and following like their own cached version of it. And when we see there's a whole every week or two, there's a piece of news that comes out that says maybe ChatGPT is building its own search crawler and maybe Anthropic has its own index, etc. Actually, it turns out a lot of the time it looks increasingly like what's happening is they're just kind of saving stored and cached versions of the rendered stuff that they've already seen. So yeah, when they go, I want to explore a whole bunch of pages and content, they can look up saved versions of the rendered version rather than just requesting the empty shell versions. Yeah, interesting.
Right, which makes total sense for them, but it also means that it's unreliable in terms of which content they're actually getting.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's probably stale and messy.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. So lovely, and we're gonna carry on looking at this because the whole diagram. I mean, I showed you this before the show. Talking about this as an entire cycle, the Kalicube flywheel is taking your business and feeding it back into DSCRI recording by the bot through traditional bots, IndexNow and MCP and WebMCP. Can you walk me through the 4 technologies that I've mentioned that allow you to shortcut?
Oh, yikes. Yeah, sure. So mention them again. So we've got IndexNow, which is the push piece, MCP, WebMCP, and what was the 4th one?
Just traditional bots that come along and discover you.
Yeah. So the traditional bots thing, and you talked about this, and I completely agree that that's a somewhat inefficient process. That you publish a piece of content at a URL, and you hope that it gets discovered and evaluated, etc. And maybe you can signpost that through XML sitemaps, internal linking, but you're essentially beholden to spray and pray and just hoping that stuff finds it. And then we see the first big evolution of that, which was Microsoft's IndexNow, where you say instead of waiting and hoping that something comes and find this, at the point of publish or update or delete or whatever, you ping off a signal to whatever the vendor is, whether it's Bing or whether it's some middleware. And then those systems go, okay, a thing has happened, now let's go and look at it. And that's super interesting because in theory, it means all of the wastefulness of kind of inefficient crawling goes away. Like traditional crawling is super inefficient. You fire a whole bunch of machines up, create a whole bunch of crawlers and robots and scripts, and you just go out and explore. And 90% of what you find is, here's a broken CSS file, here's another duplicate of page 5 of the same blog, but none of it is useful. So then you have to do huge amounts of work to reconcile that down and filter it. So a lot of that inefficiency goes away.
One point about that is Fabrice Canel was saying to me that they solve some of that with select. So they don't select if they can predict that on the other side it's going to be something broken or something duplicate.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? And Google does the inverse as well. It will look at patterns and go, it looks like you might have pagination here. Let's go and proactively explore and seek it out. So you get all sorts of kind of weird emergent behaviors with exploration. But yeah, either way, it's all very, very costly and very inefficient. And I think Bing would certainly like to do a lot less of that. Google's a bit on the fence, but yeah. Anyway, so you move.
So and IndexNow, Google haven't adopted it. Do you think they ever will, or is that a lost cause?
I think it might be a lost cause. I think the risk with it is that sufficient adoption at scale puts you back somewhere where you started, because you move from a crawl queue just to a submission queue. Like if every site on the planet now starts pinging Google every time they hit update on a post or every time they change anything, you still have the same questions of resource allocation and prioritization, etc. But you also have given a direct route in for all the spammers and bad actors. And at least at the moment, Google can do some degree of predictive evaluation for let's not crawl this domain because it looks dodgy. Whereas you've got to reinvent all of that architecture for a push-based model now. So I would like them to adopt it. I think it has some advantages, but I think it would be quite a big change for them. And they're famously not great in this space.
Right.
So maybe.
Now, MCP.
Yeah. So this is maybe the biggest thing ever, maybe, or maybe nothing at all. We'll see. So fine. 10 years ago, I want to code an integration between two pieces of software. I want to do when I hit this button, go make that software do that thing. And the way I do that is I connect up via APIs. I write a piece of script that makes a connection to a third-party exposed endpoint on a piece of software that has some logic in it that then gives that instructions. And almost all software on the web that talks to other software is built on this premise, right? We have these predefined hooks, and this thing can talk to this thing in a predictable way. And now we get LLMs and AIs, and the way we interact with those are fluffy and ambiguous and through human language rather than explicit coding. So you need a format by which, if I ask my LLM to go and update a blog post on my website, or go and add a product to my shopping cart on an e-commerce store, the LLM needs to know how to do that. It needs to understand the methods by which that websites work and what can and can't be done. And then that website needs to know how to interpret those requests and turn them back into code. MCP is the evolution of the API modality and paradigm to allow LLMs to fuzzily talk to websites. I can define the tools and tasks and things my website can do, and then anyone using an LLM or a chatbot or whatever can ask plain language questions of that, and then it can interpret it and turn it back into a request, and then pipe stuff back out as well. So you start to codify what are the tasks and tools my website can do. And that I think is super interesting, because most websites today are still just marketing pamphlets, I guess. And now you start to say, what can my website do? And if I'm, I don't know, a dentist website, why shouldn't an LLM be able to book an appointment from a calendar that manages all the availability, or help provide a diagnosis for I've got toothache and I ate too many donuts, blah, blah, blah. Like, these are things that a website could do. And now we start to see LLMs and agents acting on behalf of users. So starting to think about what services does your website provide to bots is quite an interesting area to explore.
No, I love that. And you use the word codify, which is the last part of serve. So what I'm saying is do your business as your business, serve your clients, make sure they're happy, make sure they're advocating for you, take all of that business operations and codify it, and then push it back to the bots. And MCP, what you've just said to me, I really like it, is saying you can take MCP to ask yourself the question, what do I need to codify? What would be useful to codify in order to educate the algorithms, which is my big thing, but also offer services, which is the part you've just added.
Yeah, love it. Love it. Yeah, I think that broadly, that codification of business is a bit that everyone has somewhat skipped over. And it's going to be super important years to come. Like, how do chatbots and agents and LLMs understand what you do? And then how do they interact with that? So that, like, what are the things we sell? How many do they cost? How do we interact? Getting those things really clearly defined is super important, which I guess brings us on to WebMCP, right?
Yes, that's the next one, because we can come back to Codify right after, but for WebMCP, you are skeptical? Or...
Yeah, a little bit. So, yeah.
Well, I'll just tell you a little story, because I just did a conversation with Dave Davies, and he's built a little machine that compares an AI trying to fill in a form without WebMCP.
Interesting.
It cost 50 cents in tokens. And it took, I can't remember, I think it was 1.5 minutes. And he did it live on the show.
That's fine.
And then he did it with a WebMCP, and it cost less than half a cent.
Nothing.
And took 2 seconds. So he's saying WebMCP is going to be a super advantage, assuming it gets adopted, because the cost for the engines to actually fill in forms and interact with your website is going to go right down, which makes you much more friendly and inviting and tasty for the algorithms.
Yes. So I've got two. I agree in principle. I think this is super interesting, but I've got two angles where I think it might not become the next big thing. And this is still very early days, right? One is that it assumes that the agent will be interacting with your website from the front end like a human would. And that's not necessarily the case. And there are some interesting discussions at the moment about the pros and cons of having an agent-facing version of my website, which is raw code, markdown, stripped back HTML, versus having just the human version and having agents experience it and interact with it in the same way that a human might. And there are pros and cons to both. It's a really interesting debate. But WebMCP very much assumes that the agent will load the web page, look at it visually, click into the form, do the steps, etc., which is quite an expensive and complicated way for agents to interact when they could, for example, just hit an MCP endpoint. So there's a kind of, which way is this a Betamax or VHS moment? And it depends which way it goes. And then the other concern is the mechanics of WebMCP are essentially add markup to your code. So instead of just having a form, I have a form which has a whole bunch of extra code in it, which says, this is an email input and you need to put an email address in here. And don't try and click the submit button until you've filled out the thing and blah, blah, blah. Like explicit instructions for machines that decorate things that they can interact with. And not just forms, but it's anything where the agent can take action, you provide an instruction set. And there are two problems, I think, with that. One is that that's duplicative, like having to describe the form around the form feels cumbersome. And is that a short-term limitation of these systems? And as they get smarter, will they need that? But I think the more interesting challenge is people are going to mess this up. Now, if we go back to 2011 and we're looking at the
people are going to mess this up. Doesn't that pretty much define the last 28 years?
Yeah, for very much so. This is my biggest concern with all of this. Is if you go back to 2011 and the very birth of schema.org as a mainstream thing, the main way that you implemented structured data wasn't via a nice, neat piece of JSON code like you would today, but you would mark up and decorate all the individual things. So you would go into your HTML and say, this bit is an address, this bit is the street in the address, this bit is the postcode, and it would break all the time because, shock horror, developers aren't very good. And if we're saying that WebMCP is meant to fix the problem of badly built forms that are hard to interact with, so the solution can't be to that, to get the same people who did a bad job of building the form to make the form more complicated. I don't see this going anywhere. Like the same kind of brittleness will persist throughout all of this. And we've had 15 years now of proving that this kind of micro-markup inline just breaks because developers aren't good enough.
And that's an incredibly good point. I mean, I switched from inline to JSON as soon as I could. Is there not the same thing could happen here? Is that you can simply identify the element and use JSON?
In theory, yes, and there are ways you can do that. But then you're reliant on when the developer goes in and changes the form at some point because you've said, I don't know, add a subject drop down, that they don't break that. So now they're maintaining it in two places. And again, so that the people, ironically for all of this, when we're building AI systems, the people are the brittle breaking point.
Yeah, always. And well, there's another question. I'm actually going to be talking to Kasper Kulikowski from Google.
Oh, nice.
Who's building the agential side of Chrome.
Okay, that's fun.
So Google Chrome is being built with agential capabilities inside it to be able to A, act, and B, act on behalf of third party. What do you think that's going to happen there?
I think that's super exciting. I caught wind of the very early phases of this a few years ago now, I think. And it just became mainstream about last week, where it turns out that Google Chrome is now shipping a 4 GB local model to your laptop. Unless you explicitly opt out or don't have space, your laptop now probably already in Chrome has a local model. And some of the early discussions around that were super interesting. It was things like on forms again, things like anytime there's a form on the page, if I right click into the content area, rather than having to type, I could just click activate my local AI thing to agentically complete this for me. And you start to get like a fancy version of autocomplete. But then you start to go beyond that, right? You start to go, why can't it summarize pages? Why can't it evaluate things across multiple tabs? Why can't it make decisions on my behalf? And you start to see Chrome less as a browser and more as a kind of operating system for productivity. And that's been hard to do so far because it's expensive to do all of that back and forward to the cloud. But now if everybody's got a reasonably decent model running locally, it can start to be intelligent. It can start to personalize. It can start to make proactive recommendations. It can start to protect me, blah, 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 all sorts of cool stuff coming down the pipeline.
But if I've got a local intelligence on my machine because I haven't opted out, that then solves Dave's issue, which is saying it costs 50 cents a pop. It doesn't.
Yeah. And maybe it runs in the background in an invisible Chrome tab, and it still takes a minute and a half, and it probably heats up your laptop unpleasantly. But it definitely it moves some of that
part of the problem.
Raw token costs. Yeah, definitely. And that's a really interesting idea actually. That for long-running background tasks of types that you would never do at the moment because it would be expensive to do it through tokens. Maybe you just run all of those in the background on your laptop, and it becomes a kind of it's doing eight different things in the background that I know will be finished this afternoon. And all that becomes much more affordable, and it unlocks new types of tasks and working. That's pretty fun.
But can you come back a step and explain the part of down? You said 4 gigabytes if you don't opt out. What is the system, and exactly how does it work to your understanding?
it down. So if you have enough space on your laptop and you're running a reasonably recent version of Chrome, it silently and invisibly in the background downloads a local model for text generation, which can then be used for other stuff as well. I don't think it's plugged into anything yet, but it's now there and can be utilized. So subsequent updates of Chrome, I would not be surprised to see magic buttons that say summarize this or autofill this type of thing. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, no, I'm actually looking for a pen to take a note because I'm talking to Casper later on.
I mean,
literally in an
It's also
hour.
been hugely contentious because when the spec for this was originally proposed several years ago, Microsoft and Firefox and Opera and a few others all went, no, this is problematic because it's invasive, it's non-permissioned, it's a huge amount of storage. The transfer cost of that alone to 1 billion laptops is rainforest, and Google went ahead and did it anyway. So there's some politics around this, but now that it's done, yeah, super interesting capabilities.
Right. Oh, and yeah, Fabrice Canel, when he pushed out IndexNow, was saying a big part of this is trying to reduce our carbon footprint.
Yes. Yeah, because calling's so inefficient. Yeah.
Yeah. So wrapping up this particular part, which is the bots part, the DSCRI, looking at enterprises and smaller companies, number one is, where are they most stuck for enterprises and then for smaller companies? And what should their focus be just for the DSCRI?
I think for tricky. I think for enterprises, it's almost always that their websites are a broken mess. They will have 23 different subdomains and 100 APIs and all sorts of bits of JavaScript in different teams. And when you say to a Google or a chatbot to go and call this and evaluate it and render it, etc., it's a nightmare. And wading through all of that and understanding what's what and which bits am I allowed in and which bits aren't I allowed in, and should I really be crawling all of this API stuff 1 million times a day unnecessarily, all gets very, very messy. And enterprises are famously bad at managing that ecosystem of URLs. I think about this as inventory curation, right? If you've got 1 trillion URLs on your site across 10 different domains, which of those should be discoverable? Which of those should be selectable? Which of those should be indexable? And actively managing that and going, no, we need to block this, we need to reroute that, we need to no index this, really granularly and at scale manage that. Otherwise, you know that chances are Google's going to miss a thing, they're going to expand resources in the wrong place, ChatGPT is going to fail to have pre-renders, blah, 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 blah. All these things start to become less effective. And then you're running at 80% efficiency. So 20% of the time, stuff gets missed or misrepresented and you don't get recommended. That's messy. Smaller businesses, I would say similarly, but focusing on deserving to be indexed. I think if you are a dentist, I've used this example 100 times, if you're a dentist, if your website has a page about teeth whitening tips, great. But there are 1 trillion other dentists on the planet who have the same page about teeth whitening. Like, why should a system care? Why should it choose to index? What extra value, insight, intelligence, utility, value, tooling, context, blah, 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 blah. What is it that this page does that the other 1 trillion pages about teeth whitening don't? And small businesses can do a job of it. They can be opinionated. They can have a founder with direct experience say something interesting or divisive or funny or emotive or blah, blah, blah in a way that a large company can't. So I think, yeah, digging deep into your pockets and thinking about how do I do something genuinely useful rather than just have a website with 12 pages that describe my services. There is a real opportunity for small businesses to outmaneuver big companies and enterprises by being interesting in a way that big companies can't. And that skips you a whole bunch of the systems are deciding whether you should be indexed and evaluated and recommended, etc., because you've already done something that's far better than everyone else. Most sites.
Brilliant. Well, can I say enterprises be organized, smaller businesses be interesting.
Love it. There we go. That's far better. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jono. See you in the next session, everybody.
Awesome. Bye.